I want to talk to you guys about really humanity's return to history. I talked about this in one of my prior videos, but there were some things that I forgot to mention that I did want to talk about in that video, but I just forgot. Got caught up talking about something else, but it just gave me another opportunity to do another video. So here we are. The return to history. After World War II, humanity really began an era of unprecedented peace. Human beings have been ravished with war, riddled with wars for really all of its history. But something happened after World War II. Something really unheard of in history took place after World War II. And that is the beginning of an era of peace that humanity has never really experienced. Yes, there were wars that took place after World War II. You had the Khmer Rouge, you had Vietnam, you also had the wars in the Balkans in the 1990s, but still yet, notwithstanding all of these conflicts, the era that began after World War II has been an era of unprecedented peace for much of the world. Generally speaking, you can go to specifics, but I'm speaking about generalities. Generally speaking, mankind has been enjoying an era of peace that is unprecedented in our history. So what do I mean by a return to history? What I mean is a return to the ways that mankind has been accustomed to or was accustomed to before the end of the Second World War, which is an era riddled with wars, really a world riddled with wars, a world riddled with tribalism, a world riddled with factionalism, a world riddled with just really nonstop contention, factionalism, tribalism. The ways of the world that mankind was accustomed to. You see, after World War II, something really unprecedented took place. Not just the general peace of humanity, but also a shift in our way of thinking. We said racism, and that's wrong. Racism, though, was very common, had been very common during World War II, before World War II, and also after World War II. It was common, but after World War II, there began this shift away from that way of thinking. And today, we see a return to racism. We see a return to that way of thinking. If you go on to Twitter, or X as it's known now, it is just filled with racism. Filled with racism. It is quite, for me, it's quite surreal. Because when I was growing up, we were always told about Martin Luther King Jr., MLK, as he is known by his acronym. MLK, I have a dream that white people and black people will live in harmony and will be friends and all this stuff. And now you see just an overturning of the status quo. The status quo was racism is wrong, and that is changing. That is changing. You may not see it in the surface. You may not see it when you walk outside and go to the store, but you sure as hell see it online, and it is very common. I am finding racism to be more ubiquitous and common than I do anti-racism. And when people speak about how we need to be anti-racist, you always have a wave of comments against them. And why is this? Why is the status quo being overthrown? Why is it shifting? Well, because humanity has treated itself so terribly. That's the reason why. High crime rates, people not being content, people not being grateful for living in a good society. You have people who come from different countries and they settle in first world countries, and they will act ridiculous, they will act spiteful, they will act arrogant, they will participate in crimes. Surely not all of them, but enough of them do, to the point where the native populations are growing more and more and more angry. And so the status quo is being shifted. The status quo is being really toppled. That's what's happening. We are currently witnessing, and we are currently seeing a change, just a violent change. We are living in the midst of a transition. That's what we are living through. We are living in the midst of a transition, a major transition away from the post-World War II world that we have become so accustomed to. And in a way, we are returning to multiple eras. People talk about returning back to World War II, or going back to the 1920s or the 30s, or going back to the early 1900s. I think we are returning to multiple different eras. To give you guys an example, to demonstrate what I mean, in the 1200s, the Ottoman Empire rose up. The Ottoman Turks rose up, and they started an empire. That was back in the Middle Ages. That empire eventually died around the 1920s, and Turkey became a republic. So the Ottoman Empire was reduced to the Republic of Turkey. Well, what is the Republic of Turkey doing right now? The Republic of Turkey is becoming a superpower. And the Turks, the descendants of the Ottomans, are becoming a superpower that is so widely recognized that the Americans believe that they need this superpower in order for NATO to survive, because this superpower guards the Mediterranean, which is a very important geopolitical zone, and so NATO needs Turkey. And the Ottoman Empire was a leviathan that committed countless atrocities. But this is no matter to the United States. America, as an empire, needs Turkey to be its proxy in the Mediterranean against the Russians. So we see the rise of an empire, or I should say the revival of an empire, that commenced itself in the medieval period. So in this regard, we are going back to the Middle Ages. We see the Russians and the Ukrainians killing one another. Now, what's one thing that was very common in old Europe? Clan warfare. Warfare between peoples who were the same ethnically, but were different factionally, or they were different politically, or they were different religiously. So you had, for example, political factions back in old Britain. There were people who said, no, we need to have a monarchy, and there were people who said, no, we need a parliament. Or if you go back to Italy in the medieval period, you had those who said that the church needs to dominate politics, and they were those who said, no, the church, while being a very important religious institution, should have no leverage over the political realm. That responsibility should only be partaken in by the monarchy. Back in the day of Dante Alighieri, the famous poet, this was the huge political contention that was within Italy. And Dante Alighieri was of the faction that believed that the church should not have political power. And Dante Alighieri said that the church is very important for religion, but he believed that the church should not have a say-so when it came to matters of politics and policy. And that war lasted for many, many years, and it was extremely bloody, extremely bloody. And then you had the wars of religion. In the Middle Ages, you had, in France, you had the Albigensians and the Catholics killing one another. And these were the same people who were killing each other. So today you have Russians and Ukrainians fighting and killing one another, and they are the same people. They are the same people ethnically. They are both of the nation of Rus. They're both Slavic. They both speak Russian, although the Ukrainians have their own native language, which is very similar to Russian, but still nonetheless a different, separate language. It's still of the same Slavic family. And here we have an example of two people killing one another. This is tribalism. Now, for decades, we have laughed at Muslim people because the Muslims have the religious conflict of Shiite versus Sunni. The Sunnis say, no, the mantle of Islam, the torch bearer of Islam after Muhammad was Abu Bakr. The Shiites say no, it was supposed to be Ali because Ali was a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad, or he was related. He was the nephew of the Prophet Muhammad. So the authority or the rulers within Islam should be based on blood. It should be based on who is a descendant of Muhammad, whereas with the Sunnis, it was based on another criteria. And so for hundreds of years, the Sunnis and the Shiites have been killing one another, and they still have bad blood, and they still have violent contention between each other. We saw this in 2014, 2015 with ISIS butchering Shiites. We've seen this in Afghanistan, Sunni Muslims butchering Alawis in Syria, and we have laughed at them. But what do we have here in the United States? We have Republicans versus Democrats. And for decades, the whole contention between Republican and Democrat was just, it was treated as just political rivalry. It didn't really go beyond that for the most part. I believe at one point in time, Republicans and Democrats in Congress were sharing dorms together, and they would do their job in Congress, and then they would go and hang out in a house that they would share. I mean, they were doing things like that. And so it was rivalry, but there was still a modicum of respect between the two. And now that respect is breaking down very fast, breaking down scarily fast, to the point where Donald Trump gets shot and you have loads of Democrats saying that shooter should have had better aim, or who really gives a damn about this guy. Republicans, and yes, I know I'm going to be stepping on some toes here. I don't care because it's a fact. Republicans stormed the White House, or they stormed what's it called? Yeah, they stormed the Capitol. They stormed the Capitol on January 6th of 2021. And while a lot of them were seeing it as just a game, they were a lot of them also who were violent, and they were violent towards police officers. And they talked about hanging Mike Pence. And these were Republicans. These were Republicans talking about hanging the vice president, who is also a Republican. This is tribalism. This is political factionalism. And it's becoming very real. It's a very real phenomenon within the United States. And it wouldn't surprise me whatsoever if this factionalism just imploded into outright violence on the streets, and that we would one day have pockets of violence within this country, pockets of violence based on political differences. It would not surprise me in the least if this were to happen within the United States. Well, it happened before. We had the Civil War back in the 1800s. So who's to say that it can't happen again? It's a return to history. It's a return to the dark and bloody history that has riddled mankind for most of its existence, for almost the entirety of its existence. Paganism. Paganism is becoming very, very popular. Very popular. It is, there's a debate on which one is the fastest growing religion. Some people say it's Islam. In Europe, the fastest growing religion is definitely paganism. You see more and more people talking about worshiping the sun and the stars and Mother Earth, and they're going to, Stonehenge and all this stuff. They're talking about Gaia and Father Sky and all this stuff. It's becoming very, very popular. Well, that is also a return to the history that has dominated mankind. For most of mankind's history, humans have been pagan. humans have been pagan. It wasn't always that way. Back when Noah walked out of the ark with his 3 sons, mankind at that point was not pagan. Mankind was worshiping the one true God, the creator of all of creation. But somewhere along the line, mankind revolted and began to worship the creation rather than the creator. And St. Paul gives us this history. There are 2 histories of paganism that are in the Bible. One is in Paul's letter to the Romans. In Romans chapter 1, St. Paul talks about how mankind began to reject the creator and worship the creation. And he says, although they knew God, they began to worship nature. And then they eventually reduced themselves to accepting and partaking in the evils of Sodom. And you see a remnant of that in Sodom and Gomorrah. And not a remnant, but you see an example of this in Sodom and Gomorrah and its destruction. And then the other history you find in the Book of Wisdom. The Book of Wisdom is not in the Protestant Bible, but the Book of Wisdom is in the, it's in the original Bible, the real actual compilation of the Bible, which you can find in both the Roman Catholic Bible and also in the Eastern Orthodox Bible. You can find it in the Septuagint, which was the first Greek translation of the Old Testament. You find the Book of Wisdom. And in the Book of Wisdom, it speaks of the history of paganism, and it says that mankind began to worship the dead because a man was so heartbroken by the death of his son that he formed a little image of his son, and then he began to communicate with the soul of his son, and then this became a trend that escalated to the point where people began to form images of kings, and kings really liked that because people could worship them as gods, and that was really the history of paganism. And you're seeing paganism have a revival right now. And what is this but a return to a part of human history that dominates much of our past? In 2018, there was the phenomena of the Yellow Vest movement, and this continued on into 2019, and then in the early 2020s, it sparked again with anger exploding over attacks on diesel fuel in France. Well, in 2018, you had the Yellow Vest movement, and I remember studying that movement and writing about it. And one thing that I remember about the Yellow Vest movement was people holding up mock guillotines. Now, why were people holding up mock guillotines in France in 2018? The reason for this was because it harkened back to the French Revolution. One thing about France that everyone who knows anything about France knows is that the French love protesting, and they love mythologizing and romanticizing revolution. The French love this. Oh, they love it. And they honor the French Revolution in their history, and they celebrate the French Revolution every single year. You know, the overtaking of the Bastille and the beheading of the king and the queen and all that stuff. And when you read about the French Revolution, the nitty-gritty details of the French Revolution, you find mass murder, mass beheadings, cannibalism, rape. It's a horror movie in the history of mankind. One of many horror movies that have taken place. But they romanticize it in France. And so because they romanticize something evil, that evil is very, very open to awakening itself in the souls of the population that romanticize it. That is the reality. And that is why people in the Yellow Vest protests in the late 2010s were holding up mock guillotines. And during the early 2020s, I want to say this happened back in 2022, somewhere around there, there were massive protests. And you had a situation in which a mob of, I remember seeing a video of this, a mob of French people going into a government building and taking a giant portrait of Macron and throwing it out the window, and a huge crowd of people were clapping their hands. And it's like, my goodness, it's one step away from just going full out late 18th century style revolution. What is this but a return to an epoch of history? For a long time, Islamic fundamentalism was something that was dormant. It was put under rest. It was also suppressed, horrendously suppressed. Not horrendously, but it was suppressed to a great deal. And when my father was growing up, my father was a Palestinian terrorist, and he was a nationalist. My father was a member of the PLO. Now, PLO, Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO was not an Islamic fundamentalist organization. They used some Islamic rhetoric or Islamist rhetoric, but overall, they were not an Islamic fundamentalist organization. They had in their ranks atheists, socialists, Muslims as well. My father was a Muslim, but he was also a member of the PLO. You also had the PFLP, which I don't remember. I'm trying to remember exactly what it stands for. Palestinian PFLP, Palestinian Front for the Liberation of... No, Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. I'm pretty certain that's what it stands for. Well, the PFLP was not Muslim at all. It was actually Christian socialist. Now, there was nothing Christian about them. They were Christian in name, but they had people who were a Christian in name in their ranks, and they were socialist, and they were nationalist. So, yes, PLO, PFLP, these were terrorists who did terrible things, but they were not Islamic fundamentalists. My grandmother was an American woman from California. She married a Muslim man. She went to the Middle East, lived in the Middle East for several decades, and she was living in the West Bank in the 1980s. And she told me that when she was in the West Bank back in the 1980s, she says, I remember seeing Islamic fundamentalism see a revival. It was in its inchoate stage, in its embryonic stage, just germinating and sprouting upwards. And she said, I remember seeing a group of kids, Palestinian kids, with an adult, and the adult was giving them Islamist literature. And she says, I remember walking up to this man and screaming at this guy, get out of here. Why are you corrupting these children? I'm not sure if you listened to her or not, but she told me that she saw this with her own eyes, and it sprouted. And it sprouted. And the Muslim Brotherhood played a really big role in the revival of Islamic fundamentalism. And what happened? The United States removed Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein was suppressing the fanatics. They removed him. Fanaticism revived in Iraq. Factionalism, or religious factionalism, or sectarianism between Sunni and Shiite, really exploded in horrendous violence. Iran revived as a power because Iran was being put in check by Saddam Hussein, and then with Saddam gone, the Iranians revived again in their power. So that ushered in the rise of Iran and also the rise in Hezbollah. And we're still seeing the problems with that today. Hezbollah yesterday bombed a little soccer field in Israel, and there were a group of youths that were playing soccer, and 12 of them were butchered, and they were children. They were young people. They were aged. Their ages were from basically toddlers to the age of 20, and it was pretty horrendous. But the rise of Hezbollah can be linked to the overthrowing of Saddam Hussein. And this violent sectarianism in the Middle East and this violent Islamic fundamentalism in the Middle East really, really showed itself very clearly in 2014 with the rise of ISIS. And ISIS was butchering so many people. They killed, I think, 10,000 10,000 Yazidis. They butchered thousands of Shia. They killed so many Christians. But that was Islam in its purest form being shown to the world. And it was history showing itself. Because when you read the Hadith, you read about so much horrendous violence, and we can read the Hadith and say, okay, this is pretty bad. It's one thing to read the Hadith, it's another thing to see it right in front of your eyes. That was a return to history. In this case, it was Islamic history. It was a return to it. We saw the Azeris butchering Armenians in 2020. What was that? Well, The Turks did butcher the Armenians in the Armenian genocide. The Azeris are Turks. They identify as Turks. And here we saw the Azeris beheading Armenians, executing them. I saw one video where there was a Armenian female soldier who was butchered, and then they sliced off her breast, and they filmed it, and it was just demonic stuff, absolutely demonic stuff. But this was the type of carnage and cruelty that took place in the Armenian genocide. And here we were in the year 2020 and in the early 2020s seeing just an example, or seeing just a sample of that type of carnage that took place in the Armenian genocide right in our own time. The Ottomans, or the revived Ottomans, the Neo-Ottomans, the Turks today, defeated the Armenians in the latest conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh, and they used the Azeris to defeat the Armenians. And we saw the videos of the Armenians being slaughtered by the Turkish drones. And this was a part of the revival, the current revival of Turkish power, the descendants of the Ottomans reviving their power, a return to history yet again. A return to history. Back in the, in the late medieval period, there was a man by the name of Girolamo Savonarola. He died in 1498, so you could say this was in the late medieval period. He was killed by the Catholic Church. And Girolamo Savonarola was exposing the Vatican. He was kind of like a John the Baptist. John the Baptist came over and he really was preaching against the corrupt religious leaders of the time. Savonarola was doing the same thing. He was exposing the corrupt religious leaders of the Roman Catholic Church. And Savonarola was telling people that the Vatican leaders are, not all of them, but a lot of them are into pedophilia. And Savonarola preached against the leaders, and he said, "You corrupt young girls, you corrupt young boys." Pedophilia. And so the Vatican knew, if we don't stop this guy, people are going to wake up to our evils, and people are going to revolt against us. We have to kill this man to preserve our power. Remind you of another event that happened in history? If we don't kill this Jesus, he's going to start a revolution that's going to overthrow our institution, and we're going to lose all of our power. And so they killed Savonarola. They sentenced him to death. They did a mock trial, accusing him of heresy and being a false prophet. They actually had a copy of his testimony or his confessions, and they were literally putting words in his mouth, making things up, saying that he said things that he never said, accusing him of being responsible of a famine that was taking place in a certain part of Italy. And the reason why there was a famine was because there was a war, and it had nothing to do with Savonarola, but they were blaming it on him. So it was not a real trial. It was just a trial that they did so that they could look like they were being objective, when the reality was that they were using the trial as a cover-up to mask their own evil intentions to kill a man because they saw him as a threat to their power. And so they killed Savonarola and two of his followers. And you see what just happened recently. Carlo Vigano was excommunicated. Now, they didn't kill Carlo Vigano like they killed Savonarola, and the reason for this is because the Catholic Church doesn't have any power to kill people anymore. But if they did, I believe they would kill Mr. Vigano. I think they would have killed Mr. Vigano if they could get away with it, and if they had an institution of a government institution in which they could impose capital punishment. In other words, if they brought back the Inquisition, they would have killed Mr. Vigano. But why did they excommunicate Mr. Vigano? They excommunicated Vigano because Vigano was exposing the evils of Sodom in the Vatican. And he said that the Catholic Church is deliberately hiring sodomites to be priests, and they seek sodomites to be in the priesthood. He said this. And he talked about Theodore McCarrick and how Theodore McCarrick was covering up for pedophiles, and how the Catholic Church under Benedict said, okay, Pope Benedict said, okay, Mr. McCarrick, you're not supposed to be giving Mass. You're not supposed to be traveling around. You're not supposed to be giving lectures or being a part of talks. And Theodore McCarrick was breaking all the rules. And this was under the watch of Francis. And Vigano wrote in his account that in one encounter with Pope Francis, Pope Francis asked him, what kind of a man is Theodore McCarrick? As if Francis didn't know that already. To which Vigano told Francis about all of the rules that McCarrick was breaking. And Pope Francis said, oh, and changed the subject and acted as if the discussion never happened. And Vigano wrote in his account that the reason why Francis asked him the question, what kind of man is Theodore McCarrick, was to simply gauge and find out where Vigano stood on the controversy over McCarrick. And at that point, Francis realized, this man is against McCarrick. I'm going to change the subject now. But because Vigano was so adamant, and because Vigano said that the church has become corrupt, and the church is being ruled by evil people, and the papacy is evil, they excommunicated him, just like they killed Savonarola. So the excommunication of Vigano, in a way, parallels with what happened in the time of Savonarola, and the corruption is still there. In this case, the church has not really returned, but rather it has further exposed itself and exposed the fact that it hasn't really changed all that much. And I want to read you guys a line here, just to show you how far this evil goes back. I want to read to you guys a line from this book, a short line from this book. It's called The Occult Renaissance Church of Rome by Mr. Hoffman, Michael Hoffman. And it talks about this man by the name of Peter Damian, who wrote a book called The Book of Gomorrah. And the book was written in the middle of the 11th century, and it was addressed to Pope Leo the Ninth in the year 1049, so before the First Crusade, decades before the First Crusade. And it says here that in his letter, Book of Gomorrah, addressed to Pope Leo the Ninth in 1049, wherein he, Peter Damian, refers to, quote, improper leniency on the part of prelates towards sodomite Catholic priests. Later, it was suppressed. The book itself was suppressed by the papacy. And here is a line from an historian by the name of Robert Hale. Quote, he, Peter Damian, wrote a scathing tract against homosexual practices that Pope Alexander II discreetly locked up. So Pope Alexander II wanted nothing to do with this warning, and he locked up what Peter Damian wrote. And the book goes on to say, and this is from the words of Peter Damian, it says, quote, unless immediate effort be exerted by the Apostolic See, there is little doubt that even if one wished to curb this unbridled evil, he could not check the momentum of its progress. In other words, the evil of Sodom has spread like a cancer, and if we don't put a stop to it, it's not going to stop. And it has not stopped at all. Hasn't stopped. So the question is, are we really returning to history? Well, in the case of the Vatican, we're not really returning. We're simply just seeing the Vatican for what it is. Because even Pope Francis said recently that the priesthood is filled with too many members of the Republic of Sodom. He said this himself. And he simply confirmed what a lot of us have been saying for years now. So in the case of the Vatican, we can say the Vatican isn't returning. It's just exposing itself further and further. But I would like to pose the question for everything else. Are we really returning? When ISIS was beheading people, were we returning to history? Were we returning to a bloodier time of Islamic history? Were we returning to the the historical realities of Islam? I would argue no. I would argue that we were simply being exposed to the realities of Islam, and the reality of Islam was simply being suppressed by government forces. But it was unleashed thanks to the United States. Same thing goes with the Syrian civil war, in which you had Sunnis wanting to kill Alawis and slaughtering Christians. Bashar al-Assad had been suppressing that evil. His father was suppressing that evil as well. His father was suppressing the Muslim Brotherhood. He would kill members of the Muslim Brotherhood back in the 1980s. But the evils that these governments were suppressing was simply unleashed thanks to NATO. So no, we weren't really returning to history. We were simply being exposed to a reality that was simply being hidden from us. It was being unleashed. Same thing goes with the Yellow Vest movement in France, when these French protesters were holding up mock guillotines to harken back to the French Revolution and to express their desire to behead French politicians. Were the French returning to anything? Or were they simply exposing a dark reality that had been lingering about within their collective souls? The latter of the two, I would say, is the correct observation. The fact that the French have been glorifying the French Revolution for centuries is an attestament to this reality. When you see people in Mexico getting involved in Aztec religion, and you see cartels doing all sorts of abominable murders, and they have made Mexico into a slaughterhouse and really into one giant crime scene. Is Mexico returning to something? In a way, yes, because Catholicism dominated Mexico for centuries. But still, that desire to go back to indigenous beliefs and all that was there even after the Spanish conquest. And so that movement has simply grown into a very powerful movement. And we see this with the cult of Saint Death, or the cult of Santa Muerte, which has become extremely popular in Mexico. This is a return to Mesoamerican evil, Mesoamerican sinisterism. So we're not really returning as much as we are simply indulging and partaking in an evil that has always been here. Tribalism, racism, all of these things that we thought we had conquered because of our technology or because of our ideas, they're all coming back. Revolutionaryism, revolutionary thinking, political violence, political factionalism at a major scale. I'm not talking about a few examples that you can pick out here and there, but political factionalism at a major scale is returning. It's slowly raising its ugly head, and we see it. We see the status quo breaking. We see the evil of history just looming through the haze and through the clouds of our conveniences. We see it coming back. The return of history, the respawning of history, the awakening of history from the dead. The awakening of history from the dead. And that's the bottom line. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.